All right. Thank you, Jeff, so much for joining us today. To start off, I was hoping you could give us sort of a quick introduction, tell us a little bit more about you and your background and expertise.
For sure, for sure. Yeah, thanks for having me today. I'm what many of my friends call as a supply chain geek. I have spent my entire career in one aspect or many aspects of supply chain. Started off in distribution and really have rolled it into leadership, primarily in the manufacturing side of full end-to-end supply chain. So what that means is everything from strategic sourcing to planning both on the demand and supply side, as well as distribution and logistics. So in between there, also have some manufacturing background as well. I've led supply chain for large organizations, again, primarily in the manufacturing side, both in direct consumer products as well as in steel manufacturing that would typically that product goes to other manufacturers and also have background in retail consumer product goods as well.
Right. So there's really no part of the supply chain you haven't touched at some
No,
point.
no, that's what makes the job fun.
Well, great. I think like with that vast experience, I'm curious to understand from you. Feels like the last few years have been kind of a whirlwind for supply chain leaders. There's been a ton of changes in the labor market, pandemic-driven shutdowns, material scarcity, all kinds of changes. Curious if you could maybe walk us through some of the challenges you faced as a supply chain leader and really how you've helped your organizations kind of adapt to all of these macroeconomic changes.
No, absolutely, Zoe. And I think the way you framed the question is spot on. I mean, before COVID, nobody really understood, or they've heard supply chain, but they didn't understand really what did that mean overall. And I can tell you, prior to COVID, in supply chain, we tinkered. I'll use that, generic term, tinkered with risk management. So we always looked at what could disrupt our business, upstream or downstream. And we thought, okay, well, there's things like material shortages, rail strikes, port strikes, things like that, that we've navigated the rest of my supply chain brother and I have navigated over the course of our career. But I can guarantee you there weren't many people were saying that were kind of approaching the end of 2019 saying, one of the things that we should really plan in our scenarios is what would we do if there was a global pandemic? I certainly was. Maybe there's people out there that were smarter than me that had figured that out, and God bless them if that's the case. But what that did, I think it was one of those where, I always look for the lemonade out of the lemons. And what that did, that whole experience, the disruption, it wasn't just that you couldn't get product. You couldn't get to work. You couldn't be at work in a lot of cases. And when you were, it's like, how do you work 6 feet apart from one another in a manufacturing line? So all of those challenges were just so almost overwhelming. It's like, where do you start? And I think through that process, we focus on an event that might have an impact to one component of our business. But what I realized very quickly, this impacted, the whole true end-to-end supply chain, not just within your organization, but almost within the whole ecosystem, right? As an example, we had plenty of disruption upstream, but guess what? Our customers were challenged the same way. They had the same challenge in terms of, once we got product, whether it was raw material or finished product for consumer for they face those same things. So you kind of created this, oh my gosh, I've created a disruption sandwich, right? How do I do this? It just took a lot of grit, resiliency to work your way through. And, how do you eat an elephant, one bite at a time? It was kind of like, how do I solve this one disruption at a time? Figure out, we learned about critical path and, very quickly in terms of, okay, this is the one critical path. I'm going to navigate down this and run through this. So coming out of that, when things kind of we'll call it normalized, although I'm a strong advocate that there will not be true normalization anymore, because I want to remind myself to think that way. I could say, "Yep, we're back to
Mm.
normal," and lull myself into a false sense of security, and that's not good, right? So what this has really done, it's understanding how to really break down and truly understand the components of where the disruptions are, how to prioritize them, and how to put the full mindset of the entire organization together to go after those, to solve those. So it really created a capability of developing a lot of new muscles that we didn't even know we had to begin with. They were kind of there and
Hmm.
like, oh, we better develop this very quickly. So I think that's the key learning, that's come through, in most supply chains and organizations over the last several years.
Okay. Things may have normalized, but they're never going to be really normal. And you want to remind yourself to keep thinking that way so that
Hmm.
you're almost like you've created a new level of preparedness. It sounds like too, this is a full culture shift for an entire organization. And so I'm sort of curious, you've got folks like your frontline leaders and supervisors who are in really critical positions to kind of help the rest of the organization and your full scope of employees get used to thinking this way. I'm curious, like, how do you look at that frontline manager supervisor role and the significant role they play in helping to manage this risk and disruption and this new mindset of being prepared for a total end-to-end disruption.
Yeah, that's a great question, Zoe, because I think one of the keys is, and we learned this very quickly, is the people that are the most disrupted over everything are the actual people that are doing the work, those frontline workers, right? Oftentimes, we don't give them enough credit for being able to help be part of the solution. Sometimes we lull ourselves into, okay, we're going to figure out the solution and just tell them versus engaging them. And I think that was one of the biggest learnings. Full transparency, it kind of humbled me, in terms of as I was trying to figure out in supply chain, we're kind of the conductor of the orchestra, if you will, right? And it really forced us to say, let's engage more in our frontline leaders and the frontline teams because they may have a lot more valuable ideas and actually feasible ideas than we could brainstorm sitting around a table in a conference room. So I think that was that key component is really leveraging them. But then one of the things that goes hand in hand with that is very thorough communication and feedback is what's the state of the state? What is keeping us up at night, in terms of what are the risks? Because especially again, that's what COVID taught them. It was all over the news. So they're watching and understanding. And guess what? They are fully impacted both at their home and then at their work. And the last thing you want to do when you have an impacted party is to not communicate to them what do we think is going to go on. So it drove us around more proactive communication versus reactive when those disruptions or an event of a disruption really impacted the organization.
I love that sort of the idea that you can leverage. It's almost like a secret weapon. Like you have all
It
these folks
does.
that are facing the
Mm-hmm.
facing this challenge day in, day out, and you can really leverage and pull that solutioning out of them as
Mm-hmm.
well.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. I guess in that sense, then knowing that you have that this also sort of created this new, more proactive approach to communication and capturing feedback. How have you been able to leverage those things to sort of like build a culture of resiliency?
There's kind of the secret sauce that I would say that I've used and see I've witnessed it bear, a lot of fruit. And that's a true formalized engagement process. And engagement, it's really to be a function of two-way communication. It can't be, well, we're just going to listen and hear what's going on with our employee base, but it's about that communication linkage. So that way, if we're really engaged with our frontline employees, our frontline leaders, and they know that they are also engaged with their senior leaders and even the C-suite leader, that's extremely powerful because what I always use the term is sense and react, right? You're kind of thinking about if you're walking around in the middle of the night, your electricity went out, you're sensing what's around you. You're trying to figure out what's around my surroundings. So that way it's like, I feel the wall, the light switch should be there. So I'm sensing and then I'm reacting, flip the light switch, there's no light there, right? So it's that constant looking for feedback and then responding to it. And again, it's two-way, right? So
Mhm.
employees are looking for feedback from leadership. This is what's important to us. Now, leadership is looking for that feedback from the employees, hearing what's important to them. So it's kind of like once you start the ball in motion, an object in motion tends to stay in motion, and that's what that does, right? And that's to me
Yep.
because it's akin to really good communication, but that's the tool. It's one thing to say improve your communication processes. Well, that's great. How do I do that? The engagement process is the how around the what, if you will.
I'm curious, how have you, in the past, been able to sort of leverage some of that engagement to help in these sort of periods of upheaval and chaos? Like, how have you used that two-way communication with your employees to really make sure that you can weather the storm, so to speak?
Yeah, there's two key things that kind of we have done and that I've leveraged that's been very effective. Number one, it's really, when you think about that developing resiliency, it doesn't mean things are going to be perfect, right? There's, like I said before, there's always disruptions, geopolitical, the weather systems, all sorts of things can trigger things from that standpoint. So the two components, and they play well together, is really on the leadership side is really developing, what is our risk strategy? And the risk strategy is really about identifying it, putting a number, quantifying that, so what is the impact of that risk, identifying it, quantifying it, and then creating scenarios, building out scenario plans to say, well, what if this happened? What do we do, right? And
Mhm.
part of that then is since you kind of have that scenario plan in your back pocket is communicate all that. Because guess what? Those frontline employees and the frontline leaders, they all want to know what's the next COVID, right? What are we thinking about? And a lot of times we've identified other things that we didn't see with respect to risks. Secondarily, opportunities on how to address those risks or what do we do if X happened, right? And that
Mhm.
so that other component besides just developing good risk strategy is again leveraging the brain power of your entire organization, not just saying leadership's got it all and they're going to figure everything out. And again, that also helps create that ongoing dialogue, right? That object in motion about engagement with two-way dialogue going back and forth. And yeah, we'll never eliminate all surprises, and that's part of the communication. We won't figure everything out, but we've got a handful of things that we know if this happens, here's how we would do it. And everybody has been part of that process to figure out what would be the mitigation lever that we would pull in the event of that disruption.
I really like what you're saying because it also creates this culture of almost like a near miss culture where you have your
Yep.
employee who might be able to raise their hand and say, I've seen something, I think this could be an issue. And then when they see leadership take that feedback and do something with it, then they feel empowered to continue to share because they see, oh, they take me seriously and they understand that I've seen this risk and I flagged it and they've done something with it. And then they're invested and bought in to that culture.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up, Zoe, because I think as we have gone through this process, we actually did call that out to say, where we've had, folks who've been engaged with safety management and safety systems on the floor, looking at where does the safety risks come through. We said, think about how you look at things and view things, and not just from a safety perspective, but throughout the business. And so people could relate to that because most of our employees and frontline leaders, they understood risk assessment from a safety perspective. So we took a skill that we've been training, and most organizations in manufacturing are really good about training for, in the safety component, safety prevention, and identifying those risks. So it was a muscle they had already developed. And so we just kind of pointed it in a different direction. And
Mm.
and actually people thought it was kind of fun because they now had a bigger impact, not just looking at how do they keep themselves and their teammates safe, but how do we keep the business safe? That was really powerful for them.
I love that, and the sort of connection to the company then becomes stronger. If your employee's mindset is how do I keep the business safe, then that just demonstrates how strong that culture is that folks are
Exactly.
engaged
Exactly.
that way. I'm curious, what long-term strategies do you think companies should be adopting to ensure that the workforce is ready for the next COVID? We've mentioned a few: communication and engagement. Curious how, if you were talking to a supply chain leader today, what would you tell them is imperative to implement in order to be prepared?
Yeah, I think for me again, lessons learned. It is really kind of what I talked a little bit about earlier, Zoe, about make sure that you've got a robust risk assessment process. That risk assessment goes deeper than your tier, let's call it tier one supplier, if we use automotive manufacturing vernacular, right? Is you need to be engaged with those suppliers, your suppliers and their leadership team to say, what are you folks concerned about? Because if their reality comes true, guess what? Now their reality just became your reality. And likewise, doing the same thing, on the customer side. So as an example, in the building products industry, we can make all sorts of building products, but whether the dealer can buy them, somebody's got to put those in, right? So when you think about, there's another stakeholder that oftentimes we forget about that's sitting at the table that really, if they're not keeping up, that becomes a disruption that goes all the way back through the supply chain. So it really is about looking deep, both directions in your end-to-end supply chain, and really trying to quantify that to say, okay, let's just say if you did a risk assessment and you looked at the impacts of those to your business and you came up with criteria that you would assign a number, as an example, one minor, three significant, put some numbers to it. And really, it's not about making sure it's the absolute right number. It's to give you some direction so you can prioritize it. Because if you come down and those 10 disruptions, the top two are catastrophic and the other eight don't really, they're going to impact you, but nothing catastrophically. Well, you sure know where you need to focus on. And then again, through that is leveraging, and part of supply chain is the planning scenario. So if you think about it, it's plan, source, make, deliver. So really make sure that you've got capabilities within your planning teams to be able to say, okay, team, here's we're playing cards. Here's your hand today, and figure out how would you play that hand. So here is a typical disruption that we think could happen. What would we do? And build out scenarios. So you could say that, wow, because what you're going to do is you're going to validate that impact. If you thought that it was catastrophic, your planning teams through scenario building will really be able to even further granulize that impact to it. And again, based off of supply chain being, one of our key competencies is communication, or it should be, being able to take that playbook, then kind of creating a playbook for each of those and socialize that in the organization to say, okay, this is what we're thinking. Because again, this shouldn't be a supply chain activity. This should be a business activity, because, whether it's down to frontline employees or maybe your finance and even your sales teams may have some really good insight that you might not see based off of your position in the organization. So that whole collaborative function and focus that way. And once you have those playbooks built, is share them with the organization. How do teams prepare? They develop a playbook, they get them to their players, they understand what their role would be if that happens. So that if that does happen, they pull the playbook out and say, oh, yep, this is what I need to do. That is really, I think, again, something that probably we just didn't do as robust, leading into COVID. But I think that is a capability that, that event, if you will, has taught true supply chain leaders that we've got to develop, and we have to develop it fast.
I really love that. This is not a supply chain activity, it's a business activity. And
Hmm.
you need to, like, the whole organization has to be on board. I guess a final note, like, what's one thing that you hope today's frontline leaders take away from this conversation, if nothing else?
I think it's really important with respect to the engagement side. And what does that look like? Everybody can say engagement, but, I think what true engagement looks like, what are those attributes? Because you won't get the value proposition out of that unless you do this. And it really is, we talk about transparent communications overall. If we think about those risks, and let's look at it as an opportunity, right? If we figure out how to respond to those risks that, gee, our competition's probably facing in the same way, guess what? We're going to come out better in that. This is going to be beneficial. If this were to happen, we're going to leverage it as an opportunity versus leveraging, having it impact us as a challenge. And I think, we touched on a little bit too, is empowering decision making throughout the entire organization level. Again, this is not something that should just be viewed as leadership decides everything. You want to make sure that you're enabling your frontline leaders to develop that as well too. The engagement process really is fostering a collaborative culture. That's kind of the outcome that you want when you look for tools like an engagement program to do that. And I think, from an employee perspective out of this, what are they looking for? Make sure that you're looking at their well-being in this process too. It's like, what's in it for me type of thing. Because if you're just trying to like, we're going to do this so it only just impacts how we run the business, we want to take care of our employees. They're our most valuable asset, right? And and through that, you're gonna, as you encounter these disruptions, you're gonna have one of two outcomes. You either are successful with it or you've not been successful. And in either one, you should make sure that if you're successful, you celebrate those successes. There's a lot of effort that goes into the whole risk assessment and developing scenarios and playbooks. And man, if you can come out of that winning from one of those scenarios playing through, you better celebrate that across the organization. And guess what? If the play didn't work, you learn from it, because I will guarantee you that, there'll be a similar type of disruption somewhere in the future. So look at failures and opportunity to really learn from that and kind of apply those learnings across to your entire risk portfolio to say, is there anything I learned in this that could impact all of these versus just this one event of a material shortage that maybe I experienced? I think those are the key criteria that if frontline leaders and leadership apply across the organization, you can have a much better outcome around, the disruption events, and ultimately have your employees engaged with that through the process so that they'll feel valued. And again, it's how do we make them feel valued? Because they are our most valuable asset.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Jeff.